Hey there, we are now going to analyze the pin variation that we reach after e4, c5, knight to f3, e6, d4, takes, takes, and here black plays the move knight to f6. Now we play knight to c3, and here we've seen many options like knight to c6, the four knights variation, d6, we get into a Scheveningen. But here comes the move bishop to b4, which is called the pin variation. Now, honestly, this move is not played at the very top level because some lines pretty much lead to a win for white, even though they are not that easy. We're going to study them. And here the main move is to play e5. So now black here plans to take on e4 because this pawn is pinned. That's why here white plays e5, attacking the knight. And now black pretty much always moves the knight. There's some rare move that has been played in a few games which is bad, which is to play queen to c7 or queen to e5, attacking the pawn and the knight. And here we're gonna simply take the knight. And the point is that after taking on c3, and we take, black captures with the queen, and we have a fork. But here we're gonna play this very nice move queen to d2, which gives the rook, but this queen is actually misplaced here. So now we can play the move c3, now planning to trap the queen by playing knight to b3 and bishop to d3. That's why the only way for black to save the queen here is queen to b1. But now we can play the move bishop to d3. We develop and attack the queen. The queen only has one square, so this is pretty forced. And now we take this pawn on g7, which is going to be quite a powerful pawn. Black only has one possible move, so we're playing many moves, but most of them are pretty forcing. And after rook to g8, white has, in fact, a winning position here. Even though white is an exchange down, we see how black is totally underdeveloped. Just for one exchange, all the dark squares are very weak. This pawn can be quite strong. There are many ways for white to continue, but in the model game, white played queen to g5, which is just very annoying because now we plan to take on h7 and win more material. So in the model game, white won quite convincingly. Black can take on c3, but this weakens the dark squares, and black can even do that later, so here it doesn't make a lot of sense. That's why here we have two main moves. One of them is to play knight to e4, and the other one is to play knight to d5. And knight to e4 again is a move that, with correct play, leads pretty much to a win for white. Here we can already see that the knight is loose on e4, that's why here white can try to punish that by playing the move queen to g4. So we ignore this threat on the knight, and now it is us who is going for tactical ideas. We are forking the knight and the pawn, and here black has two main ways to continue. One of them is to take the knight, but here we're gonna capture on g7. We attack the rook. Rook to f8 is pretty much forced. And now after a3, we attack the bishop and the knight, so we're gonna get the minor piece back. For example, if bishop to a5, we are not going to capture on c3. We first develop. We attack the rook. Queen to e7 is the only way to defend. And now after knight to b3, white is already having a win advantage. White is going to recover the material and even gain material advantage. We attack the bishop. We attack the knight that we can capture if the bishop moves. If we take on f8, this will also allow us to win an exchange. So black's position is already hopeless here. That's why after a3, there's one tactical idea that black has that you should be aware of, which is to play knight to b5, because now black is given a check. Here we're going to capture the bishop, and after knight takes, even though black seems to hold on to the material, here we have a very strong continuation, which is bishop to g5. We attack the queen, and the idea is to attack the queen first and then play bishop to h6. As we see now, the queen has to move. Queen to b6 is the best try in order to meet bishop to h6. which attacks the rook with queen takes. So here black defends the rook so far, but after c3, again all of black pieces are under attack, the queen, the knight, and the rook. So black's position is already bad. Black cannot capture more material because queen takes is a checkmate. And the best move that black has here is to play knight to f5, counter-attacking, and here we can simply take the queen, and after black captures, rook to g8 to keep the material. But after bishop to f8, even though we have a material balance, black's position is already very bad. The pieces are not developed, all of the dark squares are very weak. This pawn h7 is also fairly weak. We might even have ideas to play bishop to d3 and capture it and then push this h-pawn. So this is already a very bad position for black. In the model game that I showed, white won after just a few moves. And after queen to g4, instead of taking with the knight, the other kind of critical move, which is also bad but still tries to put some pressure on white, is to play queen to a5. And again we're gonna take on g7. So even though the lines are a bit complicated, are very tactical, white is pretty much ignoring black's threats and just counter-attacking. And here if black plays rook to f8, then after bishop to h6, so we play very similar moves. If black takes with the knight, then we're gonna play a3, which is a very similar idea that we saw. All of black pieces are under attack. We even plan to take on b4, for example after knight to d5, we just take there, even though we give the rook. After king to d2, there's no way to defend this rook, and white is even going to checkmate black's king. That's why taking the bishop on b4 is a big threat. And if black retreats with the bishop, then after bishop to d2, we get this pin on the knight, and we just get the material back. For example, if black breaks the pin, we just capture the pawn. We have an extra pawn, much better position, so this is just a miserable position for black. So after queen to g4, queen to a5, even though it's a sharp move, it doesn't work. Again, we take on g7. And the other alternative is to capture on c3 with the bishop, which is probably more logical. And we simply take on c3, and after queen takes, we just simply play king to e2, and white still keeps threats. Black is having problems again. Rook to f8 will be met by bishop to h6, as we saw in other lines. Queen takes just loses after queen takes, king to e7, bishop to a3. Again, we have these similar ideas on which black is having problems on their squares. So this is just a very bad position for black. White didn't even sacrifice material, and white is even attacking. And the other move that might look a bit scary is to play b6, planning to play bishop to a6. But here again, the direct moves work. Queen takes, king to e7. And now here we have this very nice move, bishop to a3. We give a check, and then we're gonna capture the bishop. So black is not in time to give this check with the bishop. For example, after taking on a3, we simply capture on c8, and we're already having a material advantage and a winning position. So knight to e4 with correct play by white is just very bad for black. That's why knight to d5 is a better move. The knight is not unprotected on d5, it makes more sense. And here we're going to continue with the move bishop to d2. We break the pin on the knight, and now black will normally capture with the knight. We saw that capturing with the bishop weakens the dark squares a lot. And here an important note, we're going to capture with the pawn, not with the bishop, because after bishop takes, black takes, and then after b takes c3, then queen to c7 forks these two pawns, so this is good for black. But after capturing with the b pawn, the bishop will normally stay on this diagonal, bishop to e7, and now we play queen to g4, and these positions are more playable for black, but still quite good for white. Here the most natural move is to castle short, but let's see other alternatives. After g6, we can continue with h4, and we see that white has quite a good position, very good control of their squares. White can develop the bishop to d3, so white has at least a slight advantage in this position. Another alternative is to play king to f8 to defend this pawn. Another logical alternative, because rook to g8 would be just very passive. But here we can also continue with bishop to d3, one idea being to castle short, and we see that white has pretty much developed all of its pieces, whereas black only developed the bishop on e7. It's true that these pawns are isolated double pawns, but there's no way for black to attack them, so white has quite an advantage here. I showed a model game on which black tried to complicate matters with h5, but after queen to f4, white still gets a very good grip on the position and won quite convincingly. So the other logical alternative to defend the g7 pawn here is to castle short, but this has a drawback, which is the move bishop to h6. We plan to give a checkmate and the pawn on g7 is pinned. That's why g6 is pretty much the only move. And here you can definitely take on f8. Black will try to claim some position advantage, mainly to equalize the position. And although white is normally doing fine here, in the model game that I selected, white played another alternative move, which I think is practically very strong, which is the move h4. So white has this idea to play h5, open the h file, maybe bring the bishop to d3, and attack black's king. And the idea to capture the rook is in the air. Playing rook to e8 would be just a bad move for the rook, because the rook on e8 is very passive. That's why black normally will leave the rook there. And the model game continued queen to a5, which is correct, trying to look for active counterplay. Queen to g3 just defends the two pawns. And black tried to complicate matters with the move d6, but white won the game quite convincingly. So we get the pin variation after the move e6, d4, and after we trade on d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, and bishop to b4. Similar to some lines that we saw in the Sicilian, black is playing actively, but in this case, this line is quite dubious. At least some lines, for example, lines on which black plays knight to e4, after e5, knight to e4. That's why it is not strange that this line is not played amongst the very top players. But you might face this line when playing as white, and even though some of the lines that we saw are clearly winning for white, they are actually quite complicated. So if you haven't prepared particularly for this line, or you're playing a fast time control, it might be hard to recall or to find the moves over the board. So you can definitely play something else, quieter moves like for example bishop to d3, defending the pawn, and just play a game, then plan to castle and get a normal position. Even though in this case black might manage to equalize more easily, you can still definitely play this position. But if you remember these lines, I encourage you to try to play them, because these are just lines on which white is winning, so I felt that it was necessary to share them. So e5 here is the critical move, and the only move that keeps black in the game is the move knight to d5. Otherwise white gets pretty much winning positions by force.